What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Killmark Collectors. I'm Brandon, and today we're going to be taking a little bit of a break from the tutorials and the how-tos and talking something a little bit more current events. This week I got to sit down with Michael JD, who is the military director and lead FC for the Silent Federation, and talk a little bit about the war and what's going on with Pantheon and GenFed and kind of where we are seeing stuff, to be honest. We talk a little bit about the meta and strategies, particularly with Entosis and some of the gameplay that has brought about, as well as some of the big fights that we have both kind of enjoyed. Now, I will say that this is not a blow-by-blow type of discussion. If you guys are interested in that, I highly recommend checking out Damon Zell's Echoes from the Front weekly podcast. And I also want to go ahead and apologize because if you can't tell, I do have a bit of a cold. So hopefully I got all the sniffling and sneezing out of the recording after some post-production work. Now, this video is about 30 minutes long. There is no video to really accompany this. It was just more of a podcast, back and forth discussion. So I'm going to play some footage from a recent battle that was in this war, but is not really going along with anything we're talking about other than it's in one of the systems. I believe this one is going to be from K4. So just for your viewing enjoyment, but don't really read anything into it. With that being said, I'm going to stop talking now so that we can start hearing from Michael JD. Enjoy. Welcome back, everybody, and thanks again for joining. Today, I've got the military director and lead FC for Silent, Michael JD, joining us. Michael, thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today.
Thanks for having me, brother. It's good to be here.
Yeah, man. You are obviously a very busy man with everything going on with the war in the South. And really, I think just kind of wanting to talk a little bit about what's going on from a strategic level and get a little bit of your perspective because, you know, as we've been talking in on comms a lot, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff going on that we as line pilots don't get to see. So, you know, just to jump straight into it, this war really was kind of I'll say a big bad, quote unquote, kind of next level up content thing. Nihilus was pretty upfront about that at the beginning, but when we started this, you know, Panth and GenFed were really kind of the two big alliances in the game. That's caused a lot of issues. You know, they've got a lot of strengths and advantages with that. Tell me a little bit about kind of the decision to jump into that and what you see as kind of their big advantages and maybe some of the ways that you guys planned around those.
So, I guess from the beginning, I recognize that Pantheon and GenFed obviously have a larger player base than us. I wouldn't say that necessarily makes them militarily stronger than the Silent or No Please Stop. Again, I'm going to try to only speak for Silent, even though this war has really brought together our two organizations. I guess one of the biggest things is Pantheon and GenFed represented a strong rival that the Silent was going to end up facing off one day, whether we liked it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And regardless of whether they say that we weren't going to war, we were never going to fight each other. When you have massive organizations that take up the entirety of nullsec in the history of EVE Online, they always go to war.
It's
And
kind of
due to the
inevitable.
it's an inevitable conflict. And at the end of the day, you know, I have an obligation to protect Silent, and I knew that if we could get to them before Capitals came out, it would be to our advantage. Especially, there's a lot going around touting the Pantheon industry, and I'm not going to insult their pilots or say anything like that. But I think their strongest advantage was the fact that they hadn't had a true war in their home regions in quite some time.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mean, to your comment about the industry and all of that, if you know, if it's going to be inevitable, we might as well, you know, take the fight on our terms, I guess, is kind of the thinking there, right?
Right, exactly. We were coming off of basically a high morale point. We just finished up a year-long war, and I think the fighting edge of Silent was exactly what was needed to kind of set the tone at the beginning of this war.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, and you mentioned earlier, you know, No and Silent kind of teaming up here and going into this work together. Both of those are very strong PvP groups, but historically there has been a little bit of friction there to put it diplomatically, right? How did that alliance really come about there?
So are you talking about the creation of No, or kind of how our relationship created or led to this war per se?
I would just say the kind of the background, if you will, because historically we've had no set to red. I think when there was some standings reset recently, everybody went gray, and then at the start of this war, there was talk of no. I shouldn't say no because that's going to just confuse people, right? But there's not
Yeah.
going to be any blue status between silent and no, please stop. That obviously has changed a little bit. And so I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, how did that come about? And, I guess kind of how did that play into the planning of some of this?
Okay. So the big thing that I'd like to clear up for everyone is Silent does not view the status of being a gray or being a red as any different from each other. We are not blue shooted organization, which means that at the end of the day, we're just setting standings to kind of identify people on the field. So there was a lot of heartache when we did a massive reset of everyone. Outside of GenFed's removal from our blue list, it really didn't mean a whole lot because it we just knew that some targets on the field we wanted to specifically identify, like no.
Hmm.
Now, the lead up to this war, we weren't. I wouldn't say that we weren't prepared to blue up. No, um, the biggest thing behind it is we were looking at the strategic necessity of what it would take to fight Pantheon properly. And at the beginning, we were going to say, hey, no, why don't you base, or, well, excuse me, they informed us that they were going to base out of NED,
Hmm.
and we were going to deploy from Cloud Ring um, down into Fountain. And, as with any flexible organization, we realized soon that it wasn't going to work properly for us to prosecute this war. So we ended up setting Tahini's organizations blue, and it just, as we started operating closer and closer together and taking the good fights together, we just realized that, you know what, we'll create this temporary organization, we'll do it the right way, and at the end of it, we'll go neutral again.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, to your point, and what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, Pantheon and GenFed having the player base that they do, it kind of seems like it made sense to have the two organizations of Silent and No really kind of work together and start that down the right path to again kind of set things off on the right tone and make sure that we set ourselves up for success in the best way possible.
Right. It was essentially a tactical necessity. We weren't sure how fast GenFed would come to the assistance of Pantheon,
Hmm.
and obviously the relationship is extremely strong, and they did what any good ally would do, and they deployed immediately to NED, and as we saw, things kind of progressed to where we are today. And the other thing I'd like to say is, regardless of our history with No, we've always had a strong respect for them. People forget that No and Silent have fought many times in the past, but um, just because we PvP against the other organization, it doesn't mean we have any less respect for their organization as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. And having flown with and against them, it's definitely a fun time no matter what. So I think that's what I at least really always get the most out of, and really to your point, respect the other guys and gals that are on the other side because of the fight that they bring and that spirit of PvP and fun that they have. So maybe to talk a little bit about kind of where we are in the war at this point. There's been a lot of back and forth, and there's been a lot of really big fights so far. Do you have any that, as either from a strategic perspective, that you would kind of consider the biggest feather in the cap, or what you're most proud of, and then also kind of from a personal perspective, having been in a lot of these fights, were there any that just really stood out to you as a lot of fun, or one that you just really enjoyed?
So I, hands down, strategically, probably the most important victory was in YAW because it set the tone to take K4 TAC, which was the Pan-Gen staging system. Um, it, whenever you lose a staging system, at least in my experience on Eve Online, it's a major blow to that organization or those organizations, and it kind of set the stage for the next day where we ended up taking somewhere around I think 10 citadels from Pangen. So I'd have to say if we were talking about the largest strategic victory, it's definitely YAW because um, the Pangen fleet ended up losing, I think, 90% of their 300 ships in that fight. And it just allowed us to walk in and get into K4, which I was actually able to attend that part of it. Unfortunately, like we've said, most of these fights occur in Euro time zone, and I'm a US player.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I guess that kind of leads me into the next question as well here of there has been a lot of damage, right, in this war, and K4 being kind of the one that sticks out, at least to me, because that was, again, to your point, one of the few that I was able to join because it was a little bit later in the workday and everything. But I mean, we've, as of this recording, I think that the numbers I saw are that we have around 15 to 17 corporate citadels that have been destroyed. We've captured another 11 or 12. And you compare that against only having lost a couple. And again, this kind of goes back to your point earlier about being in their space versus ours. So it's just naturally going to lead a little bit to that. Obviously we expected to have a good fight and to be able to win. We weren't going to go into a war thinking we were going to lose, but it seems like we've had a lot of success. What do you kind of put that up to? And uh, again, what do you kind of think is really a big driver of some of the success that we've had?
I think a lot of our success can directly be related to Mattarella and Tahini's FC. Um, Mattarella is the lead Euro time zone FC for Silent, and uh, everyone knows who Tahini is. But they were able to set a high operational tempo, and just to put it in layman's terms, basically we were just able to generate a ton of timers, and we've been able to keep those timers going thanks to our +8 and +9 time zone. George and excuse me, George, who's from SSH, and Saku as an organization, those two have been able to put up a significant amount of timers in Chinese time zone, and it's allowed us to keep Monday and Tuesday very, very busy for
Yeah.
Pantheon and GenFed. And the other thing too is there there seems to be this ideology that they're going to burn the North, and while I applaud their attempt to try to pull us away from the Southern Front, I think we're seeing some strategic mistakes being made on the Pangen side. I think some of these folks have maybe need to reevaluate some of their strategic thinking, because this war is going to be a long, long time coming, and the act of essentially downgrading all their citadels, I think, is a big mistake. While it saves resources, people underestimate the amount of time it takes to actually put a citadel in armor, and
Hmm.
then in hull, and then show up for the hull timer and Entosis it. So I think I think we have an advantage in strategic level thinking that maybe the Pangen organizations have not yet developed, and I'm sure we'll be seeing them soon.
Yeah. Well, and I think that experience is the best teacher, right? So they're as they go, I'm sure they'll be able to adapt, and we'll see some changes in the overall meta of the war, if you will. Um, so I agree with you. I think it's going to be interesting to see how things evolve in the next couple of weeks. But that obviously brings us into the next couple of weeks when we are expecting dreads and carriers, right? I mean, it, speaking of meta and speaking of things changing, that's been or that's something that I think we're all kind of keeping an eye on and watching. What do you think is going to kind of be the meta change, or what do you see coming out of this with the dreads and carriers? And do you think that there are going to be enough of them to make a difference in this war, one way or the other?
So there's a lot that goes into that question, and I think the number one, I guess, question I have is, will Netties be able to keep their timetable? Um,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of questions that I personally have, having flown caps for a significant portion of my Eve Online career. Um, I have about not just their deployment, but how are these ships going to be moved around? Are Sinos going to be used on every single ship? Will it be limited to ships? Like, there's a lot that goes into this before I'd even be able to say that they will have a significant impact.
Sure.
There is such a thing as a capital umbrella, so I do believe that um, if they are implemented and this war continues going on for several months, I'm sure we'll see their introduction into the conflict. But they're an unknown quantity at this point. I think the biggest mistake that people see out there is that these are I win buttons. And
Hmm.
um, while I hope that GenFed and Pantheon keep believing that, I for one have my doubts. So I guess the only thing I can say to that is we'll see when they're released.
Fair enough. And I mean, I think you're right. There's a lot that's going to go into it, and the devil's always in the details, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, speaking of Netty's updates and things that are being released, you mentioned Entosis just a few minutes ago and kind of the challenges that have gone into that. I think that's another area where we're really kind of seeing this in a large scale for the first time. Knowing that that was now an option, how did that change the strategic thinking for you guys, knowing that we can't necessarily just remove SOV or remove strategic points on the map? We have to now capture them and they can potentially be recaptured.
So actually, that was a big advantage for us because going into this war, we knew it was going to be expensive. We knew the SRP bill was going to be something not to balk at, but we weren't going to be happy with it. Anytime you go into large scale conflict, you're going to take losses. But the wonderful thing about being able to capture citadels is we can then downgrade them. We can take said resources and we can utilize them in our own territory or by selling it.
Hmm.
So we've captured a significant amount of citadels, and many of them are being downgraded. I think we actually just had one of the downgraded citadels in Delve pop today, which um, unfortunately there are members of Pantheon who are touting this as a victory because we didn't show up to let it blow up. But for us, like, this is a big IS grab. And if they're going to rebuild after this, if they're still going to be an organization after that, we're trying to set back their industry as we approach caps.
Hmm.
This is one of our big concerns that I mentioned earlier in the conversation, and having to place down 100 citadels again is, that's no menial task.
Right. Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying there. For a lot of folks that maybe aren't as involved in the, I'll say the strategic level, right? Folks like myself who we just fly battleships and we blow stuff up when we're told. You've mentioned downgrade a couple of times. You maybe talk through that just a little bit and how that actually works, because I know that I've played around with it a little bit on the test server, but I'm not a corp CEO. So do you mind just real quick talking about kind of how that works and the process that you guys go through to make those determinations?
So, okay, so let's say for um, we capture a citadel. We shoot it down to hull. That's the armor timer, the hull timer. And once we get it all the way through hull, we then have to use a module called the Entosis mod. The Entosis mod takes 15 minutes upon activation, where I do not believe you can receive reps, but you can hide underneath a Guardian bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And once those 15 minutes are over, you have essentially captured the Citadel, at which point it puts it back into a hull timer for 7 days, pardon. And after those 7 days, you have to defend that hull timer for it to repair. Once the Citadel repairs, you have the ability to go in, and I think it takes a day. There's a button in the management screen that allows you to downgrade the Citadel, and it takes 24 hours from pressing that button for 70% of the components to get back into your hangar. And essentially that's it. As long as it doesn't get hit in that downgrade period, you're good to go.
Gotcha. Yeah, I appreciate it. And like I said, it's interesting because I actually hadn't heard about that until you guys mentioned it in some of the firesides and things like that. And then I went and started digging on the test server. So I think that's an interesting gameplay mechanic that I don't think a lot of people are aware of.
Yeah, and I do think it's a great mechanic. The thing that disappoints me most about it is it's very unlike the EVE Online version, where you fight over constellations for the actual solve of a system. I think our current system, and yes, I understand that EVE Online has had many different varieties of Sov warfare, whether it was Pos Sov, whether it was Dominion Sov, the different varieties, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, I do think our current version lacks depth, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the game progresses.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think the interesting thing to remember too, for a lot of people, obviously you've got a lot of experience with Eve Online. This is my first Eve experience. So being able to play on my iPad has been a really cool gateway for me into this larger universe. And it's sometimes I even forget that it's only a year old, right? So to your point, I'm really excited to see kind of how this game continues to develop and evolve to be the deep strategic game that Eve Online is in a lot of ways. Um, so I mean, I guess that kind of brings me to my kind of last question here of, what would you like to see? What do you think could be improved or changed? I know that there's been a big push recently on the stability of the servers and avoiding some of these lag fests when we get into the big Citadel battles. But I mean, you just mentioned the Sov warfare. What are some other things that you would really love to see the devs take a look at or change or improve?
Oh, man, there's a lot that goes into that. I don't even know where to begin. I guess the number one thing is a more logical implementation of tie dye. I think if they properly took advantage of time dilation, um, some of these larger fights would be more manageable for the devices that people are using out there. We've discovered that the more that people use iPad Pros and basically tablets with a significant amount of RAM,
Hmm.
the more successful they are at not black screening in these large engagements. Um, so you sh- you shouldn't you shouldn't have to buy $1,000 tablet just to enjoy this game.
Yeah.
So I think they need to look in a way that optimizes it for the devices. Whether they make we call it the potato mode for
Hmm.
EVE Online, or some other function that allows these devices to keep up.
Right.
Um, the big fights are the thing that made EVE Online famous, and it I think it does a disservice to how good this game actually is that it struggles sometimes to keep 200 or 300 people on grid.
Yeah.
And whether they implemented tie dye based on the amount of let's call it um, entities in space in a specific location, or they created a request, let's call it a more efficient request system, because asking ahead of time to reinforce a system isn't always feasible.
Yep.
And it often feels like they just increase the amount of people allowed in versus increasing the performance. But
Yep.
that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, we've had some discussions about that in the content creator group as well. So I'm hoping that with the changes to the client and some of the optimizations that they've said that they're going to do, it'll help to your point and give us kind of that potato mode. But I'm hoping that's just a start so that we can get some of these really big fights that, again, to your point, made Eve Online famous.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could go a couple more things that I'd like to see
Yeah,
is,
go for it.
one, I'd like the ability for people to unanchor corporation citadels. I feel like a lot of these corporations are maybe feeling a little bit trapped in the organizations that they live in, because they've put in billions and billions and billions in assets into space that essentially, if they leave or if they decide to go elsewhere, they're abandoning. We saw the same when Neek came north. I mean, they left 3 citadels in Quirius that we just said just let them blow it up, because you know there's no point, or there's no objectively reasonable way to keep those citadels.
Right.
And then the other thing too is I wish they would take the time to develop the logistics that EVE Online took advantage of. So freighters are a great introduction into the game, but there's something in EVE Online called a jump freighter. If we're introducing capital ships with a jump drive that can essentially leap multiple systems, we should do the same with jump freighters, so that while today we killed a freighter moving, millions of tritanium, that poor guy should have been able to jump that directly into LOSAC.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see some we'll call it quality of life things implemented for nullsec entities. Because I think player retention would be significantly higher if these people were able to take advantage of a logistics and 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 a system was created that allowed them to move their stuff into, let's call it empire or high sec or low sec.
Right. Yeah, it's especially with some of the capital mods that have dropped. I know that I think I picked one up today that was 1,100 cubic meters. Right, you're not going to be hauling that in the in an empty anymore. So having some other ways to get around, I think, makes a lot of sense.
Right, and I agree with that. And I think the other nice thing would be if they actually created a jump freighter. Um, I think we would see less interceptor hauling,
Hmm.
and we'd see a new industry created. Like in Eve Online, there was an entire corporation called BlackFrog that would jump to all portions of nullsec to to deliver items to you. So it's
That sounds
I
awesome.
would
If I don't have to make
yeah,
more Jita runs, I'm all for that.
yeah, exactly. And it would allow an enterprising individual to make some ISK.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been great, man. I really do appreciate you stopping. I think we're kind of at time here. But before you go, anything else that you want to say, or whether it's to our pilots or to the guys on the other side, anything else that you want to kind of leave us with as a closing thought?
Sure, absolutely. To the silent and no pilots, keep it up. You guys are fantastic. You guys are working your tail off, and your hard work is obviously being seen. And to the Pantheon and GenFed pilots and corporations, I just want to say, um, you've shown an unbelievable and often impressive amount of heart and courage in the face of adversity. And just remember, just because you may be in one organization now, Eve Echoes, just like Eve Online, will shift and move. And just because you feel down where you're at now, you don't always have to stay there. So, I guess outside that, I'll see you on the battlefield and, enjoy the war.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael JD. We appreciate you taking the time today to join me here. For those of you guys listening at home, if you are interested in seeing some live footage of some of these fights, Michael, I think you've actually got a YouTube channel yourself, right, where you post some of this stuff.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna shamelessly plug my YouTube channel,
No, go for it,
but
man.
you know, I I do this more out of let's call it a hobby. I just kind of like video editing. I don't make any money off my videos. Often I pair it with music that I thoroughly enjoy. So if you're bored and you want to go take a look at some of the fights that we've had through the history of EVE Online or some fights we've had in Eve Echoes, check out my channel. It's just Michael JD, and you'll find me on there. Should be the silent logo.
Yep, absolutely. And I'll put a card up above so that if you guys are interested, you can find him as well. So, all right. Well, thanks so much, Michael. Have a great night. I appreciate it. And looking forward to fleeting up and heading out there soon.
Thanks for having me, brother.
All right. Talk to you soon.